Daniel had always believed that life had a way of rewarding patience, that if he worked hard enough, loved deeply enough, sacrificed enough, the world would finally bend in his favor. He imagined the moment he would stand at the altar, hand trembling slightly as he held Claire's, and whisper the words that would bind their lives together forever. He imagined her smile, radiant, unguarded, meant only for him. But life, he was about to learn, sometimes has a cruelty so precise it feels like destiny itself is laughing. The morning sun had barely crested the horizon, spilling golden light across the freshly painted walls of the home Daniel had built with his own hands. Every plank, every nail, every brushstroke had been a labor of love, a silent declaration of his devotion to Claire. It wasn't just a house, it was a promise of tomorrow. And today, just days before their wedding, he should have been awash in excitement. Instead, he was in the garage, staring at the tool bench, his mind refusing to focus. Every sound, every shadow seemed amplified. The coffee he had poured burned his tongue, but he didn't care. His chest felt tight, as if the air itself had turned to stone. "Go, Daniel," came a voice from behind, gentle and familiar form preface. Kaffir prefers saber form behind. Gentle and familiar. Claire. She stepped into the garage, her wedding dress tucked under her arm, eyes sparkling with a mixture of excitement and exhaustion. "I thought you'd be in the kitchen, drinking coffee like always." He looked at her, and for a moment the world seemed to pause. Her hair was perfectly styled, a cascade of dark waves framing her face. Lips curved into that smile he had memorized over years. But his heart thudded, not with love but with a strange, sinking fear. "Yeah, just thinking," he muttered, forcing a smile he didn't feel. She stepped closer, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "Don't tell me you're nervous. You've been waiting for this day since forever." He nodded, his throat tight. "I've never been more ready." And that was when he saw it. Not in her expression, but in her phone, resting on the counter, screen glowing faintly. A notification, innocuous at first glance. But then a name flickered across the screen, a name that should never have existed in messages meant for him, Michael. His heart skipped. "No, that Aprina Gavin. It can't be." The messages were brief, almost mundane, yet their content struck like a hammer. Plans, excuses, sweet nothings that weren't meant for him. Claire and Michael, his cousin, his best man, had been meeting in secret, smiling. Daniel felt the room tilt, the walls seemed closer, his breath caught, every sound became distant. He stared at Claire, at the woman who had promised forever, at the woman whose eyes now seemed like strangers. "Daniel?" she asked softly. He blinked, trying to focus. "Claire, who is Michael to you?" Her eyes widened, caught off guard. A flicker of panic, almost imperceptible, flashed across her face. But she recovered quickly, masking it with a smile. "What are you talking about? Your messages with Michael." Her composure cracked. For a second, just a second, the truth threatened to spill, but she caught it, smoothed it over, and laughed lightly. "Oh, just nothing, don't worry about it." But Daniel's world had shattered. Every plan, every dream, every whispered hope he had ever held now felt like a lie. And he understood with cold clarity that nothing, not her excuses, not her smile, not the years they had shared, could erase the betrayal he had just witnessed. For hours he didn't speak. He wandered the house, touching things as if searching for proof that the life he had built wasn't a lie. Each room, each corner reminded him of promises made and trust given freely. The betrayal burned hotter than anger, sharper than any weapon. Yet Daniel did not raise his voice. He did not cry. He simply observed, measured, and began to plan. The day of the wedding came anyway. The flowers bloomed perfectly, the caterers bustled, friends and family laughed, oblivious. Claire glowed, radiant and perfect in her gown, walking down the aisle with Michael's arm around her, their eyes locked in a private world he would never inhabit. Daniel stood at the back, invisible yet entirely present. He felt no urge to scream, no desire to confront them. Instead, he let the silence fill the space, let the whispers of his heart twist into something far more dangerous. Pinka's patience. Because patience, he realized, could be more lethal than rage. He left the chapel quietly, unnoticed, carrying with him not just heartbreak, but a promise. Resiré. One that would not be spoken aloud but acted upon with precision. He would not allow himself to be destroyed. He would not collapse into despair. He would rise. And when he did, it would not be a clash of fists or shouting. It would be a symphony of consequences, orchestrated so perfectly that Claire and Michael would not merely feel betrayal. We would become the embodiment of it. That night, Daniel sat in the darkness of the empty house he had built for them, staring at the walls that once held laughter, dreams, and love. He made a vow, silent but unbreakable. He would reclaim his life. He would reclaim his dignity. And the people who thought they had won, they would come to understand the true meaning of loss. And with that vow, the first spark of a calculated storm ignited within him, a storm that would sweep through the lives of those who betrayed him, leaving nothing untouched, nothing whole. The perfect beginning had ended, but from its ashes, something far more dangerous, far more formidable was beginning. The morning after what should have been Daniel's wedding felt unnervingly quiet. The house, once alive with laughter, floral arrangements, and the subtle chaos of final preparations, now seemed hollow. The walls seemed to lean closer, as if curious, judgmental, even complicit in the betrayal he had discovered. Daniel walked through the empty rooms, each echo of his footsteps a reminder of the life that had been promised and cruelly stolen. He had made his decision the night before, after Claire and Michael had reveled in their secret. He would cancel the wedding, not with dramatic confrontation, not with public humiliation, but with silence. Silence, he understood, carried far more weight than any shouted accusation. When Daniel's mother called later that morning, voice trembling with excitement, he managed to sound calm, almost casual. "Mom, I'm afraid I won't be going through with the wedding," he said, carefully neutral. There was a pause. "Daniel, what?" "Why, personal reasons," he replied evenly. "I need some time to think. I can't explain right now, I'm sorry." Her gasp echoed through the line. "Daniel, this is just days before the ceremony. Everyone is counting on you." "I know," he said softly, "but I need to step back. Please, don't pressure me. I'll call when I'm ready." And with that, he hung up. No one could understand it. Friends and family speculated endlessly. Stress, cold feet, fear of commitment. But none of them suspected the truth. None of them suspected the betrayal that simmered beneath the calm, controlled exterior of the man who had once been the happiest groom in the world. Meanwhile, Claire and Michael celebrated privately, convinced that their deception had succeeded. They toasted champagne glasses in a rented suite, laughter flowing as freely as their arrogance. "Did you see Daniel's face this morning?" Michael asked, smirking, eyes glinting with mischief. Claire laughed, swirling her glass. "It was priceless. I can't believe he didn't say anything. He just disappeared, like a ghost." Michael leaned back, triumphant. "We've pulled it off. Everyone will think he's the one at fault. It's perfect." They didn't see the storm brewing. They didn't see the patience quietly taking root in the man they thought they had bested. Daniel didn't confront them. He didn't call or text. Instead, he observed from the corner of a cafe across town. He watched Claire walk down a bustling street, phone pressed to her ear, laughing a little too loudly, her hand occasionally brushing Michael's as they talked. He noted the subtle mannerisms, the patterns of behavior that made them vulnerable, Michael's arrogance, Claire's vanity, their mutual dependence on approval from friends and family. At first it was agony. Each smile, each whispered conversation, each careless glance was like salt in a wound. But slowly, Daniel's pain evolved into something sharper, clarity. He realized that in every flaw, in every weakness, there was a key, a way to undo them without ever raising a hand. Daniel began keeping meticulous notes, names, dates, habits, favorite places, triggers. Every little detail was a piece of a puzzle that he intended to complete with precision. He watched them at parties, at work events, even through social media posts. Each display of carelessness, each hint of arrogance, each lie they told themselves and others, it all fed into a growing blueprint. And while they reveled in their victory, unaware of the quiet storm, Daniel cultivated patience. Patience wasn't weakness. It was weaponry. It was the understanding that the perfect moment to strike is never rushed. Interactions with friends and family. Friends called concerned and curious. "Daniel, everyone's worried. Are you okay?" He smiled politely, nodding at casual comments. "I'm fine, just taking some time for myself." He attended family dinners, nodding at questions, deflecting inquiries with vague answers. No one pressed too hard because he seemed fragile, confused, even heartbroken. They thought they saw the man they had always known, the man they had pitied. They did not see the architect of their eventual ruin. Yet, it was not easy. The nights were the hardest. He would lie awake, replaying every memory with Claire, every word spoken, every promise whispered. Anger and sorrow battled within him. There were moments when the desire to lash out, to confront, to destroy in the immediacy of passion tempted him. But Daniel remembered the vow he had made in the stillness of the empty house, patience. He would not settle for a fleeting satisfaction. He would build a justice so precise, so undeniable that they would understand too late the magnitude of their errors. In the darkness, he made plans within plans, contingencies within contingencies. He became a student of betrayal, dissecting the anatomy of deceit to understand how to weaponize it, not recklessly, but surgically. During the day, he wore his mask perfectly. At work, he smiled, joked, made small talk. Friends asked about the wedding. "It's fine," he said. "It's just timing wasn't right. No one suspected." Everyone was fooled. And that, he realized, was the most potent part of his plan, the illusion of weakness, the deception of despair. Meanwhile, Claire and Michael continued to flaunt their victory. They were careless, blind to the scrutiny that had begun. They believed the story they had crafted for everyone else, perfect, untouchable, victorious, but Daniel saw everything. He cataloged every flaw, every lie, every overconfidence. He waited for the cracks to form, for the perfect moment to weave his carefully constructed web. At night, Daniel often returned to the house he had built, now eerily empty. He walked the halls, touching the walls, imagining what it would feel like for someone else to inhabit them without respect, without love. Each room held memories, and each memory stoked the fire of determination within him. He didn't hate them, not yet. Hatred was messy, impulsive. What he felt was a cold, measured resolve. A desire not just to punish, but to reclaim. Not merely to break, but to construct something stronger from the ruins of betrayal. The mask of silence was complete. To the world, he was a man defeated, withdrawn, fragile. To himself, he was a storm gathering strength. And every storm, no matter how quiet at first, eventually leaves its mark. The months that followed Claire and Michael's wedding were a blur to the outside world. Daniel vanished from social circles, absent from family gatherings, retreats, and celebrations. To anyone who asked, he appeared to be healing from heartbreak, attempting to move on. To those who knew him best, his absence was confusing, painful, yet none could fathom the depth of what lay beneath the calm exterior. But Daniel was not healing. He was transforming. He sold the apartment he had once shared with Claire. He moved into a modest but modern loft in the city, carefully chosen for its anonymity. No traces of his former life remained, no photos of Claire, no reminders of dreams once shared. The house that had held so many memories was sold quietly, the proceeds diverted to his new ventures. At first the work was painful. He would spend hours alone, staring at blank spreadsheets, reworking business proposals, and shaking his head at minor errors. Each mistake reminded him of Claire, of the life stolen, of the betrayal he had endured. Yet, instead of giving in to despair, he channeled every ounce of heartbreak into building something new, something strong, something untouchable. He became disciplined to the point of obsession. He woke before dawn, ran until his lungs burned, and returned home to work on investments, startups and ventures he had long dreamed of but never dared to pursue. His mind was a razor, honed by loss and determination. Pain became fuel, heartbreak became strategy, and the world slowly took notice. To friends and colleagues, Daniel seemed to be moving on. He smiled at work, made small talk, and occasionally joked over coffee breaks. Some remarked that he seemed lighter, others that he was reborn. But in the quiet moments, when the office was empty or the city slept, Daniel was plodding. Every conversation he overheard, every business opportunity he encountered, every personal flaw he observed in others became a thread in a larger tapestry. Even as Claire and Michael lived their lives, flaunting wealth, power, and perceived superiority, Daniel's mind worked tirelessly. He studied them, learned their patterns, and observed how greed, arrogance, and indulgence had begun to dominate their lives. Claire, now married, had become the center of her social circle. Her confidence had bloomed into vanity, her laughter louder, her ambitions more reckless. She spent money carelessly, flaunted her lifestyle, and underestimated the fragility of her position. Michael, meanwhile, indulged his ego, investing in ventures without research, trusting friends who sought to exploit him, and treating Daniel's absence as a victory. His overconfidence was palpable, and Daniel noted it all, cataloging it with meticulous care. The couple's arrogance created cracks, small, barely noticeable to outsiders, but Daniel saw them as doors. Every indiscretion, every misstep was a lever he could eventually pull to precise effect. As Claire and Michael made enemies through reckless business decisions and social manipulation, Daniel quietly befriended those same individuals. He offered advice, loans, or subtle support, never revealing his true motives. Slowly, he'd built a network of allies, people who had been wronged by Claire and Michael, people who were ambitious yet cautious, people who trusted Daniel without suspicion. Each ally became a piece in his intricate plan. He was no longer reactive, he was proactive. He was no longer a victim. He was the architect of an eventual reckoning, carefully constructing every detail to ensure maximum impact. Daniel's transformation was not only external, he had become colder, sharper, more disciplined. He no longer allowed emotion to cloud judgments. His heartbreak remained a silent companion, but it no longer dictated his actions. Instead, it served as a compass, guiding him toward precise, calculated moves. Physically, he maintained a presence that was striking. His posture was confident, his gaze steady. People noticed a subtle intensity in his demeanor, an aura of someone who had endured and emerged stronger. Friends commented on his charisma, colleagues noticed his acumen. Daniel was quietly rising, both in influence and in the respect of those around him. From his loft, Daniel would occasionally glance at social media, watching Claire's posts, Michael's announcements, the ever-expanding circle of their acquaintances. Each photo, each comment, each status update became a data point. One evening, he paused over a photograph Claire had posted, a luxurious gala, friends laughing, champagne flutes raised. No, fuit. He noted the positioning, the subtle gestures, the relationships on display. Michael was standing too close to a new business associate, someone with a reputation for dishonesty. Claire was laughing at a joke from a rival who had previously undermined one of Daniel's ventures. To Daniel, this was gold, not for vengeance yet, but for understanding. The world had revealed its weaknesses, and he had taken careful notes. Daniel's rise was not just in preparation for revenge, it was also a series of small victories. A deal here, a partnership there, a subtle business maneuver that allowed him to quietly outperform competitors. Each success strengthened his resources, his confidence, and his network. Claire and Michael, unaware of Daniel's ascent, remained absorbed in superficial triumphs. They had won the battle of the wedding, but Daniel was winning the war that mattered. By the end of the chapter, Daniel is no longer merely a man scorned. He is a force of quiet authority. He has grown wealthy, influential, and intelligent, with a network of allies who unknowingly serve the purpose of his eventual plan. He has transformed pain into power, betrayal into strategy, and heartbreak into meticulous preparation. He is no longer a victim. He is a predator, calm, calculating, and unstoppable. And somewhere deep inside, a small, satisfied thought forms. The day will come when Claire and Michael will realize not just what they lost, but what they never truly understood. The man they betrayed had become far greater than they ever imagined. The storm is coming, and Daniel is ready, Claire and Michael had once appeared invincible. To outsiders, they were the golden couple, flaunting wealth, charm, and a social life that many envied. Beneath the glittering surface, the foundations of their marriage had begun to crack, and Daniel had quietly laid the first stones of their undoing. It started subtly. Claire began staying out late, attending gala events without Michael, lobbing a little too freely at the attention of wealthy admirers. Michael, initially indulgent, started noticing the shift in her behavior. He scoffed at first, attributing it to stress, ambition, or a fleeting desire for excitement. But small suspicions began to gnaw at him, the slightly delayed text, the faint perfume that didn't belong, the defensive tones when he casually questioned her whereabouts. In arguments, once rare and minor, began to flare over trivialities, an unpaid bill, a forgotten appointment, the choice of a dinner guest. Each fight seemed inconsequential in isolation, but Daniel from the periphery watched with careful attention. He noted the weaknesses, the insecurities, the cracks forming between them. Daniel didn't strike directly. That would have been reckless. Instead, he manipulated through suggestion, whispers, and small provocations that seemed innocent. A mutual acquaintance, whom Daniel had befriended months ago, casually mentioned a lucrative investment opportunity to Michael. Daniel's subtle nudging had ensured that Michael trusted this contact completely, overlooking warning signs. Meanwhile, Claire was gently encouraged by another contact, again aligned with Daniel, to consider social ventures that subtly undermined her financial stability. These suggestions seemed like opportunities at first glance, glamorous, exciting, promising prestige, but Daniel knew the hidden dangers and watched them step right in. He introduced tiny temptations, encouraging small indulgences, minor indiscretions, a flirtatious message from a business associate, a subtle financial shortcut suggested by a friend. They were all part of a growing pressure system, slowly compressing the couple from all sides. As the cracks widened, arguments became louder, more personal, more destructive. "You never listen to me," Claire shouted one evening, throwing a designer vase across the room. Grass shattered on the floor, echoing their collapsing domestic harmony. Michael's response was sharp, defensive. "I do listen!" "But he stopped, realizing how futile the confrontation was. Both of them were tired, anxious, and overly sensitive. Small frustrations had become flashpoints ignited by the subtle provocations Daniel had sown. Each argument left them emotionally drained, yet Daniel observed calmly from the shadows. He made no move to intervene directly. There was no need. The seeds of discord had already been planted. They only required time and careful nurturing. Daniel's genius, Bob and Cyper sighing. Daniel's genius lay in his understanding of human psychology. He knew both Claire and Michael intimately, more so than they realized. He exploited their weaknesses with precision. Daniel ensured she received attention from men who subtly challenged Michael's dominance, triggering jealousy and suspicion. Daniel introduced opportunities where Michael could overreach financially, tempting him into reckless decisions that would later amplify his guilt and paranoia. Daniel whispered, subtly through conversations with friends and associates, half-truths that made them question each other's loyalty and intentions. The couple began to argue not just out of their own flaws, but because external pressures had magnified those flaws. Every insult, every accusation, every act of suspicion was a thread in Daniel's carefully woven tapestry of ruin. Claire, once the queen of poise, began snapping at staff and friends. She spent late nights in secret, her social calendar, a carefully curated facade hiding indulgences she no longer felt guilt about. Michael, increasingly aware of her cold distance, doubled down on his own reckless behaviors, investing in ventures without research, ignoring red flags that Daniel had anticipated. Friends started noticing the tension. Are they okay? Someone whispered at a gala, but Daniel's influence ensured that any concern was dismissed. To outsiders, Claire and Michael's lives appeared unchanged, yet the rot had already begun. Watching from a distance, Daniel felt no joy in their suffering. Not yet. What he experienced was a cold satisfaction, a sense of inevitability. Their arrogance, greed, and carelessness had created openings, and he was merely guiding them toward consequences they had brought upon themselves. He would sometimes visit the cafes where they frequently dined, noting body language, arguments, and small gestures of tension. Claire's crossed arms, Michael's impatient tapping, a glance filled with mistrust. Every subtle moment fed into his understanding of their vulnerabilities. By the end of the chapter, the cracks were no longer subtle. Their friends whispered about the arguments, business associates noticed Michael's reckless moves, and social invitations began to dwindle as gossip spread. Daniel's web was tightening, yet he withheld the final strike. Patience remained his greatest weapon. He did not need to rush. Every misstep Claire and Michael made brought them closer to their undoing. He was not acting out of anger. He was acting out of strategy. No. The chapter closes with Daniel walking past a reflection in a shop window, catching his own gaze. There was a calm intensity in his eyes, a quiet promise. He knew that the storm was gathering, and soon the first drops would fall, not at random, but at his design. The world Claire and Michael had built, golden, untouchable, perfect, was beginning to fracture. And Daniel, calm, composed, and unseen, was holding the blueprint of their destruction in his mind like a masterful chess player. It started subtly. Michael received an email, carefully crafted, casually presented, appearing to come from a credible source. It outlined an investment opportunity in a technology startup, promising exponential returns. To an outsider, it looked legitimate. To Michael, it looked irresistible. Daniel had ensured every detail was perfect. He had befriended the broker months ago, planted credibility, and waited for the exact moment when Michael's arrogance would overpower caution. Sitting in his loft, Daniel watched through discreet security feeds, monitors capturing every move of his carefully targeted cousin. He noted Michael's excitement, the slight smirk forming on his face as he clicked through graphs, financial forecasts, and, perfect, Daniel thought, too perfect to resist. Meanwhile, Claire, oblivious to the subtle orchestration behind her life, had indulged in another affair. Daniel had known, of course, and had prepared for the moment to expose it. A trusted friend, aligned with his plan, shared evidence discreetly with people who mattered, colleagues, social acquaintances, and mutual friends who had influence over their social circle. Lalian. The news spread quickly, subtle at first, a whispered question, a curious glance, a poorly timed rumor. And then like wildfire, the scandal ignited. Social invitations vanished. Conversations once warm grew cold. Manned colleagues began avoiding Claire. Business associates hesitated to sign deals with Michael. Michael, unaware that he had been lured, invested heavily in the fraudulent venture. Within days, returns failed to materialize. Panic set in, calls went unanswered, legal notices appeared, the empire he had believed invincible began to crumble. Claire, shocked as her infidelity became public, tried to repair the damage. She contacted friends, apologized, and attempted to regain composure. But the world was no longer listening. Invitations continued to decline, business offers stalled, and whispers turned into pointed stares. Her social power, once a source of pride, evaporated, arguments became louder, sharper, more personal. "What? Yo, how could you?" Michael shouted one night, pacing the penthouse suite. "Didn't you think at all?" Claire snapped back, fury blazing. "I didn't, Michael. You think you're innocent? Look at your investment." "You've ruined us." The apartment, once a home of luxury and laughter, had become a cage of tension and despair. Every glance, every word, every gesture was a reflection of distrust and panic. Through it all, Daniel observed, silent and composed, his plan had worked perfectly. The arrogance, greed, and carelessness of his cousin and former fiancée had been exploited with precision. Now, he didn't gloat, he didn't rush. He simply noted the subtle moments of panic, Claire checking her phone obsessively, Michael muttering to himself about lost opportunities, both of them isolated as former allies turned distant or hostile. Patience, Daniel reminded himself. Patience is everything. By the end of the chapter, the couple's finances were in ruin, their relationships in tatters and their social standing destroyed. They were not yet completely broken, but the first major strikes had landed, and the world they had built to flaunt superiority had begun to crumble under the weight of their own mistakes and Daniel's strategy. Daniel walked past a reflective glass window one evening, catching his own image, calm, collected, unshaken. He smiled faintly, not with malice, but with quiet satisfaction. The storm was no longer approaching. It had begun. The night was perfect. Crystal chandeliers glimmered over polished marble floors, music floated softly through the air, and every detail of the lavish party was designed to impress. Guests arrived, expecting an elegant evening of laughter, celebration, and fine wine. Few suspected that tonight would be a reckoning, one they would never forget. At the center of it all stood Daniel, dressed sharply, posture impeccable, eyes calm and observant. Not a hint of rage betrayed him, only the measured composure of a man who had orchestrated every step of this evening to perfection. Claire and Michael had arrived, unaware of the trap. The invitation had been vague, a celebration in honor of long-standing friendships and successes. They had expected social recognition, a chance to flaunt wealth, power, and charm. They had not expected confrontation. Yet Daniel had made sure every ally, every person who mattered would be present. The witnesses were key, friends, family, and former associates who had either been deceived by the couple or played a role in Daniel's long game. The music stopped abruptly. A hush fell across the room. Daniel stepped forward, calm, collected, and commanding attention with nothing but his presence. "Thank you all for coming," he began, voice steady, measured, yet imbued with authority. "Tonight is special. Not for the reason you might expect, but because some truths cannot remain hidden forever." Claire and Michael exchanged uneasy glances. The room shifted, whispers began to ripple through the crowd. Daniel continued, "Some years ago, I was engaged to someone I loved deeply. I believed in honesty, loyalty, and shared dreams. But I was deceived, betrayed, not by strangers, but by those I trusted most." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Eyes turned toward Claire and Michael, who stiffened under the gaze of every guest. "I spent years building a life with someone I trusted, but betrayal has a way of revealing character, both yours and theirs." Slowly, methodically, Daniel unveiled the truth. He recounted Claire's affairs, Michael's deceit, the reckless arrogance that had blinded them, and the carefully executed manipulations that had led to their social, financial, and personal downfall. He didn't shout, he didn't curse. Every word was precise, delivered with calm authority. Every investment, every betrayal, every lie, it has all come to light. And now you see the consequences of your choices, magnified by your own hands and by the patience of those you underestimated. Gaps filled the room. Friends and family leaned forward in shock. Former allies, who had once turned away from Daniel, now realized the magnitude of his strategy. Claire and Michael's faces drained of color as humiliation took hold. For the first time, the couple felt powerless. Their arrogance had blinded them to Daniel's patience. Their greed had made them reckless. And now, in front of everyone, they were exposed. Daniel's voice softened, but the words struck harder than any accusation could have. "You believed you could triumph without consequence. You believed that deceit would shield you. Tonight proves that nothing built on lies can endure, not friendship, not love, not power, not trust." He turned away, leaving them to absorb the magnitude of their defeat. Claire's eyes filled with tears, Michael's jaw clenched in silent fury, but neither could speak. They were abandoned, exposed, and utterly powerless. Daniel walked through the crowd, nodding politely to those who had supported him quietly over the years. He did not gloat, he did not laugh. He merely moved with calm dignity, reclaiming what had been stolen from him years ago, his peace, his pride, and his rightful sense of justice. As he reached the doors, he glanced back one final time. Claire and Michael were left surrounded by whispers, pity, and the consequences of their own arrogance. Daniel stepped into the night, free from their shadow, a man who had transformed betrayal into art. Claire and Michael's world had crumbled completely. Divorce papers lay unsigned for weeks, their bank accounts drained, and friends once enchanted by their charm had vanished like mist. The laughter, power, and luxury they had flaunted were now memories bitter and hollow. Everywhere they went, whispers followed, and doors once open to them were slammed shut. Meanwhile, Daniel walked through a quiet park at dawn. The city hummed softly in the distance, unaware of the storm that had just passed. He breathed deeply, feeling the weight of years lift from his shoulders. There was no gloating in his stride, no malice in his smile, only the calm assurance of a man who had reclaimed what was stolen from him. Nay, he paused by a fountain, watching the water ripple in the morning light. For a moment he imagined the couple he had once loved and trusted, how far they had fallen, how their arrogance and greed had built their own prison. And yet he felt nothing but clarity. The world had been set right, not through anger or revenge for its own sake, but through balance, patience, and precision. Daniel turned away from the fountain, his reflection catching the rising sun. There was power in his calm, elegance in his patience, and a quiet joy in the knowledge that he had mastered the art of turning betrayal into strength. He didn't need to gloat the truth of their ruin, and his triumph spoke louder than any shout. As he walked through the awakening city, he imagined the lives ahead, his own rebuilt and unburdened, full of possibilities. The past was no longer a chain, it was a tool forged in fire, tempered by strategy. Betrayal had once broken him, but from the ashes he had risen taller, sharper, and more unshakable than ever. And somewhere deep inside he smiled, knowing that some victories didn't need noise or spectacle. They needed only patience, timing, and the art of letting consequences speak for themselves. The camera would linger on him, the sun glinting off his face, the city alive around him, leaving the audience with a single haunting truth. A man who had been wronged could become a force no betrayal could ever break. A master of revenge transformed into art.